Well, I read through that handbook for the recently deceased. It says, live people ignore the strange and unusual. I myself am strange and unusual.
Coming to you on the Paranormal UK Radio Network.
It's a strange hobby. Curious. Wouldn't it be better if you put her someplace? I've caused you some trouble.
The first Thursday of every month at 8 p.m. GMT and EST and 5 p.m. PST.
Are you mad at me? How mad at me are you?
The female perspective on all things paranormal.
I'll buy a cup if you buy a box of my delicious Girl Scout cookies. Do we have a deal? Are they made from real Girl Scouts?
From the East Coast to the West Coast, across the pond and the world beyond.
Captain Howdy said no.
Captain who?
Captain Howdy.
Who's Captain Howdy?
You know, I make the questions and he does the answers.
Oh, Captain Howdy, I see.
Nice.
Oh.
Not a psychiatrist, she needs a priest. She's already seen every psychiatrist in the world, and they sent me to you. Now you're going to send me back to them? Help her, just help her.
What an excellent day for an exorcism.
It's time for ParaDivas.
They're here.
Definition of diva. To describe a person who exudes great style and personality with confidence and expresses their own style and not letting others influence who they are or want to be. A person whose character makes them stand out from the rest. A person who tries to achieve what they want and who do not let people get in their way, and doing so with style and class. We are ParaDivas. Kari booked us a fantastic guest tonight. Her name is Laura DiDio, the reporter who was given the exclusive story for the Amityville haunting from George and Kathy Lutz. She is also a professional writer, investigative reporter, and a tech analyst. Welcome, Laura DiDio, to the show.
Welcome, Laura DiDio.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So tonight, for our listeners who are well-versed in the paranormal, you will know Laura DiDio, as Marie said, as being the investigative reporter who had the exclusive story with the Lutz family and the Amityville haunting. Laura, can you tell us now, you had a background in parapsychology, is that correct, when you started investigating?
Well, I was always interested in the paranormal and things like that. My mother was psychic.
Oh.
But it was not something that she talked about or practiced a lot. She just always knew when things were going to happen. But I think everybody in their family has somebody who's a little psychic. In the mid to late 70s, I had an internship at Channel 5 News because I was pursuing my degree in communications. I wanted to be a broadcast journalist. And that's how I came to work at Channel 5, initially as an intern, then was working there part-time as a stringer, and finally, before I graduated, I was hired as a full-time news assistant.
Okay. And that's what you were doing. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so basically, ironically, just before the Amityville story broke in the news, Kathy and George Lutz, I was producing, at the behest of Mark Monsky, the news director, a series of reports on different aspects of the paranormal, parapsychology, interviewing, different media persona on, different parapsychologists and psychics in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut tri-state area. But while I was at Fordham, I had the Warrens, Ed and Lorraine Warren, on my show, Dimension. At that time, prior to the Amityville story, they were well known in the tri-state area for their, ghost hunting, if you will.
Right. Psychic investigations, I guess.
Yeah, they were well known, but they didn't have the national presence that they came to have, as a result of the Amityville story. Okay. Certainly at that time, I would say that Hans Holzer had much more of a, marquee or brand name recognition, because he had written several books, including The Ghost Hunter and several other books. He had traveled abroad quite a bit, and he was much more aggressive at promoting, at marketing and promoting himself, and he had also done several documentaries that had appeared. Actually, he had done a documentary on the Cafe Bazaar, which had been, of all things, a discotheque, in Greenwich Village, that had been the stables that had been owned by Aaron Burr.
What?
And that was haunted by the ghost of Aaron Burr.
Oh, my gosh.
Our former vice president, and people would be actually on the dance floor. Think of this in the late 60s. People would be, dropping acid and poking up. And all of a sudden, they'd turn around, and there would be a guy in period costume and, very intense-looking man. And who was this strange-looking guy? And then he would suddenly disappear.
And
they would have no idea. And it turned out that Hans was called in to investigate, and they did a whole documentary on Channel 5 about it. And it was the Cafe Bazaar was actually Aaron Burr's old stables, and they found out it was his ghost. So when the Amityville thing happened, the first person I called was Hans Holzer. But Hans actually wanted to do a full-blown documentary, and Channel 5 was like, no, we just have to get out there and do the story. So Hans, imagine he wanted to do it upright as a documentary with a budget, and Channel 5 says, no, we have to do this down and dirty. Let's get out there right now. And so it never came together that way, and instead we called the Warrens. And I say this, I'm making a point of saying this because Hans was not wrong in saying, well, why don't we do this right, do it upright, get a budget.
Yeah. But
in the news business, even in those days, there was a sort of sense of immediacy.
Yeah, you got to get out there and get the story right away.
Be the first.
But as an independent TV station with a limited budget,
yeah,
they wanted to do it as inexpensively, cheaply as possible.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a big thing because we did it when we went in to do the seance. It was on the weekend, and that meant we had to hire an extra crew, and it was a big deal because I was getting paid time and a half, and even though I was getting paid a pittance, and it was a big deal because they even had to budget to pay for sandwiches for us. Not kidding. So our operations manager was not too happy.
No.
And so this was breaking. But one of the real reasons I'm mentioning this is because over the years, a lot of people have, critics have dissed the Warrens and said this, they didn't, they thought that they were charlatans, this, that, and the other thing. Yeah. I want to make it very clear up front that when I called the Warrens to ask them if they would come and do this, Lorraine answered the phone, Ed got on the extension phone. They never asked for any money. They asked about the background of the case. They asked about the Lutzes and wanted to know about the kids, what was going on. Never at any time did they ask to be paid. All they ever asked us for, if you can believe this, Lorraine, and she had such a sweet voice, and if anybody watched the movie The Conjuring, Vera Farmiga, the actress who portrayed Lorraine in The Conjuring, nailed her portrayal of Lorraine.
Yeah,
she got her down to a T, with Lorraine just being a very sweet, very motherly,
compassion. I've always got
human being. Yeah. And what was interesting, Lorraine said to me, and anybody listening will get a real chuckle out of this. She says, "Will Channel 5 pay for our gas and our toll?" That's all they ever asked for.
Well, I don't think they were in it for the money. I think Lorraine, and I never met Lorraine Warren, but I've listened to a lot of her, I've seen a lot of her interviews. I think she was she just wanted to help people because she could.
Yeah, and they never made any money from Amityville itself. Where they made money was when they did a lecture.
Yeah, like tour lectures at the colleges or whatever.
No, I mean, it wasn't until decades later when, The Conjuring came out that they made money on any of that. So but they never made any money from Amityville.
Yeah, no.
So anybody listening to this should know Lorraine and Ed didn't make any money, and certainly Channel 5 didn't pay them for the interviews or anything like that, or, going in for the seance. They didn't make anything.
Now, how did you first hear about the Amityville haunting? I mean, because typically things like this, you don't hear about stuff like this in the news. How did that come to your attention? How was that brought to your attention?
Well, I think we should probably back up a little. So almost anybody who lived in New York, in the in the New York area, heard about the Defeo murders on December 13th, 1974. Anybody who's listening, who under the age of 30, may not have heard about the Defeo murders, so this might be news to them. But in December 1974, Ronald Defeo Jr., who at the time was 21, 22, was living with his parents, Ronald Defeo Sr. and Louise Defeo, and his 4 siblings, who ranged two brothers and 2 sisters, who ranged in age from his one sister, who was just under the age of 18, to his youngest brother, who was 9. And Ronnie Jr., had problems with substance abuse. They were an upper middle class family, and he had, like a lot of kids, he had problems with he was at odds with his parents, especially his father. And he took a high-powered rifle, and in the middle of the night, he shot his whole family. Amityville is located about 50 miles, east of New York City. It's in Suffolk County, Long Island. It's a very upscale community, and you don't usually have sextuple murders there.
Yeah.
In fact, in the past 100 years, you've probably only had 2 or 3 murders. Okay, it's a very quiet bedroom community. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue, and they've changed the address since the murders in 1974, is now 108 Ocean Avenue. It's an idyllic 3-story Dutch colonial house that sits on the river. It's got a boathouse. It's got an in-ground swimming pool. It's got everything you would want. Sculpted lawns. It's a beautiful
house. It's a beautiful house.
Yes, it's an idyllic setting. It's in a wonderful community.
Yeah.
What nobody could understand at the time, the murders, was, number one, his parents and 2 of his siblings their bedrooms were on the 2nd floor, and then another couple of the siblings their bedrooms were on the 3rd floor. They were all shot. They were all found face down, and apparently none of them, why didn't any of the victims wake up? Why didn't they defend themselves?
Well, that's the question.
Why were all 6 found face down?
And toxology reports said they weren't drugged.
No, they were not drugged. And why did no one in the neighborhood hear the shots? Even though it was mid-December, okay, and when you would have had the windows closed, this is not, Montana.
No.
Where houses are miles apart. You're still while it's not New York City or Baltimore or, a really densely populated neighborhood where everybody's, where it's an apartment building, still the houses are fairly close together. It's thickly settled, but nobody heard anything. So Ronnie Defeo was quickly arrested. He basically ran into one of the local bars several hours after the murder and said, "Help! My whole family's been killed." It took the local police department about a day to zero in on him as the chief suspect, and within a year he was brought to trial and he was convicted. He is still to this day incarcerated and he's serving life in prison for all 6 murders. So shortly thereafter, George and Kathy Lutz purchased the house.
But let's go back one little bit. One of the things that Ron Defeo did say was that voices told him to kill his family.
Well, that happened, I think, I don't think he said that initially at the original trial.
Oh, okay.
I think that happened afterwards, Okay, so, I mean, certainly, the thing about Ronnie Defeo is that he has changed his story quite a bit.
Okay.
He is not what I would call a credible...
He's not reliable.
No, he's not a credible witness. He changed his story a lot, and he also had substance abuse problems. He's also, at various times, said that his sister Dawn was involved and committed 2 of the murders. He said he had accomplices. He said he didn't do it. You name it, he came up with things. So I think...
So he's all over the map.
Yes, and I think what happened was once the Lutzes moved in and eventually contacted Ronnie's attorney, William Weber, after they fled the house, then I think this business of voices and the devil made him do it and sort of took on a life of its own.
Oh, okay. All right. So he was sort of just, he's not really a good source. And
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't, as a reporter, or if I were the district attorney, I would tend to, be highly skeptical.
Okay.
Of what he said. I will say that William Weber, his attorney, did a very credible job of defending him the first time around, even before, the Lutzes moved into the house and appeared on the scene, because, the deck was stacked against Mr. Weber.
Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah, because yeah.
Well, I mean, if you look at any time you have a situation where a defendant murders a member of the family, you might, like the Menendez brothers.
Yeah.
Where they claimed, Eric and Lyle Menendez claimed that their father had abused them. They could still never account for, they had a problem, the attorneys, with accounting for, well, what about the mother, who was a much more benevolent or benign figure?
Yeah.
Especially when the brothers, shot her several times. So while it was well known that Ronnie, father and son in the Defeo household, came to loggerheads quite a bit, Louise, the mother, was a very benign figure, and what would cause Ronnie to also kill his 4 brothers and sisters,
like his little brothers and sisters. And I mean, voices aside, what's always stymied me is, why didn't anybody else hear?
That, by the way, that stymied the district attorney. There's anybody who was interested in this case. There was a wonderful story. There's a wonderful book out, which I thought was one of the best books, called The Amityville Murders, which was co-written by Gerard Sullivan, who was the chief trial attorney at the Suffolk District Attorney's Office at the time, and Harvey Aronson, who was a journalist, and he was a contributor at New York Magazine, Sports Illustrated, and he wrote several several books. He worked at New York Newsday, and he had written a lot of investigative books at the time, including The Defense Never Rests, The Killing of Joey Gallo, and actually, he's still alive, Mr. Aronson, and I had the pleasure of speaking to him and interviewing him a few years ago, for a couple of years ago for my own book. And of course, both Mr. Sullivan, who is since passed away, and Mr. Aronson, they always believed that the story of the Amityville haunting, was made up as a publicity stunt, which is their perfect right. A lot of people believe that.
Yeah.
But one of the things and they did impeccable research, Mr. Aronson and Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, again, was the Suffolk County DA. And in the last page, the epilogue of his book, what he said was, he says he still puzzles over the Defeo case, especially about the children. And he puzzles, he was still, I don't want to say haunted, but he still wonders about all the unanswered questions. Did any of these victims wake up? Because they were all found, and if so, why didn't any of them attempt to defend themselves? Why were all six found face down?
Yeah,
why
they're all sleeping in the same position.
Why didn't anyone hear the shots? Now, this is not me. This is the the chief prosecutor in the case.
Yeah.
So it was, so right away. So this is setting the stage, for what would become the haunting. So you've got a sextuple murder in a quiet, upscale hamlet. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Defeos themselves were an Italian, devout Roman Catholic family. And now you have George and Kathy Lutz moving in. And Kathy and George, this was a second marriage for both of them. Mm-hmm. Kathy had 3 kids by her first marriage, Danny, Christopher, and Melissa, or Missy. They were, at the time, 9, 7, and 5. And Kathy was devout Irish Catholic. And George, at the time, he was not Catholic. As he described himself to me, a sort of lapsed Methodist. So they moved into this dream house. I mean, imagine if you lucked into getting a house like the one I've just described, 3,500 square feet, boathouse, pool on the water, pool, all the amenities,
fireplace,
and for $80,000.
That's
But they were also aware that the reason the price was so low was because of the Defeo murders. Am I correct?
Yeah, and not only that, I had spoken to Louise Defeo's father, Mr. Briganti. He had a Buick dealership in Brooklyn, and he was the one who was actually paying the mortgage on the house.
Oh.
And you can imagine, I mean, he loved his daughter. He had commissioned, they had all these paintings on the wall, oil paintings, and he had commissioned the paintings of his daughter. So when they sold the house, they sold a lot of the furniture
to the Lutzes.
To the Lutzes.
Yeah.
Now, and I remember Kathy telling me when they bought the house that, the house was a crime scene for a long time.
Yeah.
So when Kathy went in, she was scrubbing the blood off the walls.
Oh, my goodness.
And Kathy and George bought a lot of the furniture. So they actually bought Dawn and, the bed that Missy was sleeping in had been, Dawn or Allison's bed. Well, now, I don't know.
They were optimistic that there was probably nothing wrong, right? They did. You don't go in. I mean, that even proves to me even more that these people were not people that were deeply entrenched in paranormal beliefs. Because, I mean, I wouldn't buy somebody's bed who they were shot in because my beliefs. So. Yeah,
well, I'll tell you. Myself, it was only a year after the murders that they moved in.
Yeah.
It was a bare year. Because I think the Lutzes moved in around, December 5th.
Yeah.
And the murders had been December 13th. So it was just a little less than a year.
Yeah.
But myself, this is my personal opinion. I personally would not want to move into a house.
No.
There are 6 murders that had been the site of 6 murders, including 4 kids, just less than a year before.
No, I wouldn't have.
And I wouldn't want to purchase. I have some antiques in my house, and I can't really say the history of all those antiques. I would hope that they weren't.
Yeah.
Something violent.
You wouldn't knowingly buy something that somebody had been killed in a bed and then let your kids sleep in there.
For the record, I absolutely would buy the house.
Yeah, I know you would. You weirdo. You weirdo. And then no, you would. I wouldn't.
That's just my personal preference. No. Maybe if somebody had said it had happened, maybe if I had heard it had happened 30, 40, 50 years before, but just a bare year before and where kids had been involved.
Yeah.
It's my personal belief and opinion. I mean, I would want to give it a little bit more time to settle down myself.
Just to clear the vibes.
That's just me. Now, a lot of people don't believe in ghosts. They don't believe in spirits, and for them, that's fine. I wouldn't foist my personal opinions or beliefs on anybody.
No,
yeah.
And certainly the Lutzes were very aware. You couldn't have lived on Long Island or in that, community and not have been aware of those 6 murders. It was big news.
Well, and that just did the blood off the wall.
And she knew. Yeah. Yes, they knew. They knew.
They knew.
And they did discuss it as a family. Now, a little bit when we went in there at Channel 5. So basically, what happened was the Lutzes held this. They went in there. They were in and out in 28 days, and they basically said that when they went into the house, things started to happen slowly at first. Their personalities began to change, that, they began to experience things, from seeing a lot of flies congregating on the wall. George said
could never get warm.
Yeah, he said he could never get warm.
Yeah.
Kathy said that she felt like the house worked on women differently from the way it worked on men. George felt like he was angry and aggressive. He told me that he was ordering the kids around like a drill sergeant. Kathy told me she looked in the mirror and she saw a face of an old hag.
And it took hours to go away. And the woman, I think I read, did she tell you about the woman, is this true that what she said, she smelled perfume and somebody would touch her in the kitchen?
Yes. She also, I guess, there was also time when she and Danny were sitting in the kitchen and they felt a presence there.
Yeah.
And Danny told me that they felt like something walked right through them.
Oh, so scary.
And then Danny and Chris were upstairs in the bedroom. Their bedroom was the one that I guess had been occupied by Ronnie Defeo Jr.
Mm-hmm.
And they saw this sort of black figure coming towards them. And I guess they also found some of his drugs, Ronnie's stash of drugs.
No way.
Under the floorboard in the closet. A great thing for a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old to find.
I'm surprised the police didn't find that when they were, clearing the crime scene.
I guess they weren't searching for that. Who knows?
No.
But Missy, the youngest, who was 5, she had talked about, her friend Jody, I guess the pig, with the red eyes. So she seemed to have had, I guess, the most benign or the most benevolent type of experience. But she was a 5-year-old, so she didn't seem to be traumatized or scared by it. The boys also talked about the bed levitating, and then Father Ray Pecoraro, who had gone in to bless, he was present there. I had met him on one occasion at Kathy's mother's house, because when they left the house, they went to live with Kathy's mother. And she had a nice house. They were sort of cramped, though. She wasn't, typical middle-class bungalow house. And when, she had her other daughter living there with her. And, things get a little tight when you've got, your daughter, her son-in-law, and 3 kids moving in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the priest, Father Pecoraro, said he said in no uncertain terms he went in to bless the house, and he heard a voice very distinctly tell him, "Get out," and it hit him in the face. He got hit in the face.
Oh.
So
he told you that? You met him and he told you that?
Yes.
Oh.
And he actually did make one appearance on television talk show at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Only one. I think it was on one that Leonard Nimoy was hosting. It was a TV series.
In Search Of.
And after that, at the time, the Catholic diocese basically told him not to do it. It's a big difference from today.
Yeah.
Because the Catholic diocese actually has a PR department that will handle and field questions, a PR office that will field questions on the paranormal.
Oh, wow.
And that's out in Chicago. And they actually will send priests, for training over in the Vatican on exorcism.
Oh, yeah, like that guy from The Rite, the movie The Rite, that priest.
Yes.
That young priest, I can't remember his name.
There's a lot of that. So basically, though, what had happened was when the Lutzes finally fled the house after 28 days, and they went to live with Kathy's mother, at that point, they contacted William Weber, Ronnie DeFeo Jr.'s attorney, who was trying to get an appeal for his client. And again, so they contacted William Weber, told him about their experiences, and I believe that's when William Weber thought he could, based on what had happened to the Lutzes, that he might be able to get an appeal for Ronnie on the basis of, possible possession, the devil made me do it type of thing. So they held a press conference, and that's how
you heard.
It was in New York Newsday. And you can imagine this, of course, coming, just 2 years on the heels of The Exorcist.
Yeah.
And so fortuitously enough, I was doing that series for Channel 5 at the time on the paranormal. So everybody wanted to try, and myself and every other news outlet wanted to
get in on this story.
Yeah, get in on the story. So Wednesday, February 11th, and the articles appeared in New York Newsday and also in the Long Island Press, detailing these so-called strange events that the Lutzes said happened in at 112 Ocean Avenue. And that was Wednesday and Thursday, the 11th and the 12th of February 1976. So everybody was trying to get a hold of George and Kathy Lutz. Now, what's really probably incongruous to a lot of people listening to this in 2019 is that in those days, you didn't have cell phones.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay,
or internet. Or, you couldn't just find somebody like you can Google their name today.
Yeah, you couldn't do that then. How do you get a hold of George and Kathy Lutz? So everybody was bombarding the law offices of William Weber and Bernie Burton, who were representing Ronald DeFeo, and they were also acting as the spokespersons for the Lutzes. Now, William Weber was amenable to speaking with people, speaking with the press, but it was unclear at the time what exactly had gone on at 112 Ocean Avenue. Mm-hmm. William Weber admitted that he didn't know much about the occult, and his vested interest was in Ronnie DeFeo. So we were being told, call back next week. And again, we were talking, we're trying to talk to the lawyers, Weber and Burton, and the next thing you know, they were saying, hey, Channel 7 Eyewitness News has been invited to film an exorcism of the house that was going to be conducted by a team of white witches on February 28th. And it was going to be this contingent was going to be headed by Stephen Kaplan, who taught courses at Stony Brook on parapsychology. And Stephen Kaplan also bills himself as the director and founder of the largest clearinghouse of vampirology in the world. I'm like, okay, so I called Stephen Kaplan. I thought this was a little odd, but we're trying to get the Lutzes, and it was interesting, and it was William Weber had said, well, Channel 5 can come in and film The Exorcism as well. So it looked like it was going to be Channel 7, Channel 5, you know, it looked like it was going to be a cast of thousands.
Yeah.
So I said, well, could you give my number to the Lutzes? And Mr. Weber said he would do so, and they kept saying they were working on it and working on it. Anyway, so sometime around 20th of February, what happened was I had asked them to give my number to the Lutzes, and while I was out of the office on assignment, George Lutz did call and said he did call me back.
Okay.
And it was kind of strange because he was it was like walking a tightrope, but he said, could I meet him on Saturday? Could I meet he and Kathy on a Saturday out at his office? And at the time, he had a family business, a surveying business.
Right.
Out in Syosset, Long Island. So I said, sure. And I didn't tell anybody in the office anybody at Channel 5 about it because I was afraid that he still might not agree to give us the interview. Mm-hmm. And being a lowly news assistant, if the interview fell through, I would be in big trouble.
Right.
You know?
Right.
So I could see my career being over before it began. Well, that could happen because if you ever look at any of those front page stories, you know, journalism stories in the, you know, those old 1940s, 1950s things,
yeah,
where they say, you know, you're fired. That's exactly the way it was.
Oh.
You know, get me rewrite. Well, so I didn't tell anybody what I was doing, and this is, you know, Saturday, my day off.
Yeah.
Anyway, I went out to meet them.
What did you think of them? What did you think of them when you met them? Like, what did you...
Well, that was interesting. It was funny because I have all my original notes and what have you, and I said my original impression was I wasn't sure who was the reporter because they had more paraphernalia than I did.
Oh.
In terms of notebooks and, you know, tape recorders and things like that. Nowadays, we just have our iPhones or our tablets and record there.
Yeah.
But I talked to them that first day for nearly 5 hours.
Oh, wow.
And my first impression, and you have to understand, as a reporter, we're trained not to be gullible. We're trained to be skeptical, and if anything, to err on the side of disbelief rather than belief, and to question everything.
To get the real story.
Yes, but my first impression, because... Look, if I came back and I swallowed everything that they said, hook, line, and sinker,
yeah,
and I came back to my news director who said they're full of bleep,
yeah,
then I'm going to look like an idiot.
Yeah.
But my first impression was that they acted really scared, terrified. Okay, now if they were really faking all of this,
yeah,
then I have to say they were wonderful actors.
Yeah.
They were Meryl Streep and Robert De Niro.
Oh, wow.
Or pick whoever your two favorite Academy Award-winning actors are, because they were doing that good of a job. So at the end but I spent 5 hours with them. So at the end of that time, they said, okay, you'll be the one to get the story. How? That wasn't, you know, established. What I did was tell them, look, you know, I have experience I have contacts in the field of, you know, parapsychology. I know professionals in the paranormal. And I said I was going to help them by putting them in touch with, you know, someone reliable. And then they also said to me at the time, don't tell Bill Weber and Bernie Burton of any of their plans. And I said, okay, whatever you say. So on Monday, though, what had happened was Steve Bauman, who was the original reporter on this, did do an interview with Bill Weber on the front lawn of 112 Ocean Avenue, and they did discuss the strange happenings, the alleged strange happenings at the Amityville house, and the fact that the Catholic Church had been brought in, and that the Church's Council of Miracles had been studying the case. And I also had gone out to do some research at the house. I went to go to the Amityville Historical Society, to take a look at things. And I remember George Lutz called me, and he was pretty wound up. Dealing with George was always sort of like holding a hand grenade.
Oh.
With the pin out. Okay. He was very displeased. He called me, he says, "You violated our agreement about going near the house and talking to Weber." And I said, "Wait a second. I didn't know anything about the fact that Steve Bauman was doing an interview with William Weber. And in the scheme of things, I'm just a lowly news assistant."
Yeah. You have no control over what they do.
I can't block Steve Bauman, who's one of the top reporters at the station, from doing an interview. And I didn't know anything about it. So you can imagine how I felt.
Yeah, I can.
So what happened at that point, I had been talking to Marvin Scott, and we wanted to, we got in touch at that point with Ed and Lorraine Warren, because Hans Holzer, as I had said earlier, when we had called Hans, he had said, "Well, why don't we do this right and do a documentary, put some money behind it?" And it's like, well, nice suggestion, Hans, but Channel 5 wasn't going to spring for that.
Yeah.
And Hans said, "Well, I'm not going to do it then." I'm sure Hans was kicking himself after that, but the Warrens, couldn't have been nicer and couldn't have been more accommodating. They listened to everything we had to say, and I can still remember Lorraine saying, "Could you give us gas money and pay for the tolls?" And at the time, where they lived in Monroe, Connecticut, and coming down to Manhattan, you had 5 pesky tolls on the turnpike to come down that were $0.25 each. A quarter doesn't sound like a lot, but these 5 tolls really messed up the traffic because you have to stop to pay the tolls. And then you had the bridge tolls, etc. By the way, the bridge tolls nowadays are, I think it's like $8.50 to go over the bridge one way.
Yeah.
It's prohibitively expensive, but
it is, yeah.
Yeah. But the Warrens, we only gave them the sketchiest details of the case, and fortunately for us, they were free to come down and they readily agreed, and I had interviewed them before for my radio show on WFUV, and Marvin had also filmed a story with them involving a haunted church in Connecticut. So we had both Marvin Scott and myself had really good interviews with them before, and, thought very, very highly of themselves. Meanwhile, when the Lutzes, so this was up to February 25th. So meanwhile, what was happening was, in background, George Lutz was vacillating between rescinding permission for us to go into the house and film and letting us have free reign on the story, because he still believed that by letting us do the story, he might incur the wrath of whatever was in the house.
Right.
So you can imagine how nervous I was, because they owned the house. At any time he could, during this 24-hour period, he could have pulled the plug on us.
Yeah.
And then I was going to incur the wrath of my news director, who was a much more real presence.
Yeah.
in my life than the demon that might be lurking in the Amityville house. And trust me, the news director was a real tyrant. But it was a real nail biter.
Yeah.
And there was a lot going on. Now, this part of the story is where it gets real. This is where things start to get really interesting in terms of snafus. So we were supposed to, of course, in typical fashion, we were late leaving the station at Channel 5 to get all the way out to Long Island. A lot of traffic. So we were supposed to meet George Lutz at Ocean Avenue to get the keys from him to go in. And turns out he wasn't there. No George Lutz. Steve Bauman says to me, if this story falls through, Laura, you're going to be stuck working in the mailroom for life. Just what I was worried about. So then after waiting a few minutes, trekked down to the Amityville police station. And you can imagine how happy the local cops were to see us, because nothing happened in Amityville before
all of this, yeah. Murder,
all of
this, yeah.
You know, and so this haunted house, they didn't mind telling us this haunted house was making life miserable for them because they were spending half of their time shooing people away from the house, and not just on foot. They actually had to go out by boat. People were coming up the river to try and get into the house.
Everybody wants to see the ghost.
Yes, but they were coming by boat.
That's crazy.
I mean, you know, so then we said, well, can you call the chief of police at home, Bill Kay, because he knew how to contact George Lutz. So you can imagine how that went over.
Mm-hmm.
No, the chief is home having dinner. We don't want to disturb him for a bunch of ghostbusters. So then Lorraine Warren and I sort of like refused to budge until they made the call. Now, again, no cell phones, folks.
Yeah.
Now, here's where it got interesting for us, because at one point, Lorraine and I went to one of the local phone booths to try and call George Lutz at his mother-in-law's house. And we're trying to make, this is before, you know, we're trying to make the call, and all we're getting is static in this phone booth. It wasn't working. Now, normally, you know, if anybody listening to this would say, well, it's, you know, typical, it's a phone, if anybody remembers what a phone booth is.
Yeah, right.
Okay? It's just like Superman used to change in the phone booth.
People, they're using phones out on the streets in boxes that you put a quarter in and you can call.
Well, it used to be a dime, but, you know, then it was a...
This is true.
Anyway, a lot of static, what have you. Now, you might think, okay, it's just, bad mojo, bad juju, what have you, or just bad telephone lines for Ma Bell.
Yeah.
Except then somebody knocks on the booth door and asks to use the phone booth. So we obligingly get out of the phone booth, and yes, you could fit a couple of people in the phone booth, and this guy gets into the phone booth, and he makes the call with no problem.
Oh.
Ray and I look at each other. We get back to the phone booth, try and call again, same thing.
Right? And I read in that book that, in the Jantz and Amityville Horror book, that whenever George Lutz was trying to call Father Pecoraro, he couldn't get through.
Well, and finally, after this happened 2 or 3 times, I started to become convinced that something was here. So that's when Lorraine and I trucked down to the police station and asked if they could call the police chief at home to get a hold of George Lutz. Mm-hmm. So then finally, we did get a hold of George, who met us at the local pizzeria. Again,
did he explain why he didn't show up at the scheduled appointment at 112 Ocean Drive?
Well, he did, but we were late by an hour and a half, and he told us that he was becoming physically ill just sitting outside the property.
Okay.
So George Lutz gave us the keys to the house, and then he gave us the phone. He gave us all the phone numbers where we could reach him. And then he told Steve Bauman that any and all information to the press would go through me and only me. So then with all, I'm like, okay, so I have job security for as long as this story lasts. So anyway, we parked the car in the driveway before going in. And then Lorraine Warren said, she tried to explain, she said, let's all take a minute and just be quiet and meditate. And she said, okay, here's what we'll be doing. Ed's going to guide me, and we're going to go through the house room through room and room by room, and I'm going to try and get my impressions. And, I'll go into a light trance, and we'll just, get ourselves in the right frame of mind. So do whatever you folks want to do, meditate or pray for a couple of minutes just to get ourselves in the right frame of mind. So after we did that, she turned around and asked Steve and myself if we wanted to any of these various sacramentals, Catholic sacramentals, to carry with us. Well, I'm Catholic. Steve was Jewish, and so she held out this crucifix. And here's Steve. He reached over me, and I'll never forget this. And he says, "Can't hurt," and he grabbed it. And my mouth, my jaw dropped open. I already had a scapular and a crucifix and armed myself already. But I mean, you have to understand, Steve Bauman was an Emmy Award-winning reporter.
Uh-huh.
And almost everybody in the Channel 5 newsroom, I mean, the motto of the Channel 5 newsroom was, "If it bleeds, it leads." Okay, he used to cover riots.
Oh, wow.
Most of the reporters at Channel 5 carried handguns. And again, in the 70s, you had a huge drug epidemic going on in New York City, mainly heroin. So if anybody, like the movie The French Connection, was all about the heroin trade.
Right.
In 1976, in the bicentennial thing, we had the tall ships in New York selling also, the heroin trade was big that they were selling packets of heroin in bicentennial packaging.
Oh, my God.
Wow.
Okay, so I say this because Steve Bauman did so many exposés on drugs. We had a lot of, you had a lot of riots. There were, with racial, a lot of racial overtones and things like this.
Yeah.
So this was a man who was not faint of heart.
Like seasoned and hardened and yeah.
And he covered a lot of crooked politicians. His life was threatened. I mean, he went toe to toe with things. Yeah. So sitting in this car next to him and just seeing him grab for this crucifix, saying it can't hurt. It was like, huh? It was really funny. So we went into the house, and the Warren said, "Look, stay with us. Don't go wandering off." And we no sooner got into the foyer of the house when Lorraine said she was struck with the feeling of something, an onerous, oppressive presence. Now, anyone listening to this right now who doesn't believe in spirits, the afterlife, ghosts, demonic beings, anything like that, will say, okay, this is a lot of hooey. And, quite frankly, I will tell you, I can't feel these things, so I cannot testify to the fact that of what Lorraine was feeling.
Right.
Because I can't feel it.
Right.
Either. It's not like saying, okay, wow, it's cold outside, or, I feel this wind rushing by me.
Yeah.
I can only tell you what she said.
Can you repeat that description again, please?
What she said was, when we got into the house, we got into the foyer, and the Amityville house, it has a big central foyer, and there are rooms off to the side. The living room is on one side, the dining room is on the other.
Yeah.
And as soon as we got in, Lorraine said she felt an oppressive presence.
Okay.
So we were touring the house, and Lorraine was pointing out the worst spot: the second floor sewing room, third floor playroom, the basement closet. And the basement closet, that's the so-called red room, which in the movie was supposedly the portal to hell.
Yeah.
The one that everybody was calling that demonic room. It wasn't really a room.
No.
And it was painted red because there was a sale on red paint, and Ronald Defeo Sr. told the kids to, just sort of paint it. It's like a room under the stairs.
Yeah.
So the kitchen, and then in the master bedroom on the second floor, that was where Ronald Defeo Sr., and Louise, that was their bedroom. Lorraine went into a light trance for the cameras, and Ed was asking her questions. And she basically said that the water had a lot to do with the force that pervaded the house. She also picked up on the fact that Louise Defeo had died in that room. Now, she didn't know whose bedroom it was.
No.
Or anything of that nature. Steve, at that point, was in a rush to finish things so that we could get back to Manhattan, because remember, we were running an hour and a half late, in time to edit the film to get on the 10 o'clock broadcast. So that was a Wednesday night, so the next day we were inundated with calls. That just whet the public's appetite. Everybody wanted to see what was going on in this house. I mean, people were flooding the newsroom with calls, and because now the Warrens had been on TV and said, and Lorraine had basically given her perception, and she, again, knew nothing about who had been in what bedroom, what had happened. She only had very sketchy details, and she had only met George Lutz. She and Ed had only met George Lutz for about 5 or 10 minutes. They hadn't gotten the whole background on what had happened to the Lutzes, and George was not very forthcoming about their experiences in the house. And that was a real bone of contention at that point between Ed and George.
I bet.
Now the public is hearing this, and they're seeing a psychic sitting in a bedroom where the Defeos had been murdered. And this is better than Poltergeist so far with the water of force. So I had kids calling me up, teenagers presumably, saying, "Hey, can we go and spend the night in the house?"
Crazy.
By this time, now what has happened by Thursday or Friday, the 26th or the 27th of February, the Lutzes had basically broken off with Weber and Burton. So there wasn't going to be, and the whole business, the planned business with the White Witches going into the house to conduct the exorcism and, anything with Channel 7, that was all off.
Okay.
So Channel 5, at that point, we had the exclusive. What had happened was that Friday night, the 27th, we arranged for the Warrens to meet with the Lutzes and myself, so that the Lutzes, could tell the Warrens what had happened to them. No TV cameras, nothing. The Warrens needed the background on the story, and they wanted to help the Lutzes. But it didn't really start off as very successful, because George Lutz, in particular, was really reluctant to give Ed Warren any useful information. Again, I assume, both of you have seen the movie The Conjuring?
Yes.
I was going to say, this is really reminiscent of our last month's interview with Andrea Perrin, when she, right, Kari?
Yeah. What was your connection to The Conjuring, Laura? What were you going to say?
I had actually gone into the farmhouse with the Lutzes.
Oh,
and I've spoken to Andrea, who's a wonderful writer.
Lovely. Yeah.
And I was just going to basically say, I was actually more scared when I went into the Perrin farmhouse.
Were you?
Yes, than I was in the Amityville house, because for whatever reason, and I don't know how to describe it, but my gut feeling when I went into the Amityville house was that whatever was in there was not interested in me.
Okay.
No, it seems like it was more geared toward males. I mean, that's kind of already been established.
No, I mean, the psychics that went in there, the women, did have a reaction, but I never felt that it was interested in me. Mm-hmm. Okay? For whatever reason. But the Perrin farmhouse, well, first of all, it was an old farmhouse. Okay?
Yeah.
So it looked and felt spookier. Even though, unlike in the movies where it was off the road, the real farmhouse is on the street.
Okay.
Much closer to the street. But it's a farmhouse. But that place was spooky.
Oh.
But what happened in that movie, they didn't even, as I'm sure Andrea told you, what was depicted in the movie was only the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. She did tell us.
There were far spookier things that actually happened to them.
Very scary.
But Patrick Wilson, okay, he never got the actor who played Ed Warren in the movie.
Yeah.
He's a very good actor. I've seen him in other things.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, since Ed Warren died in 2006, Patrick Wilson never got to meet him. So he played, his portrayal of Ed Warren he portrayed Ed Warren as a sort of much more laid-back, gentler figure. Mm-hmm. In real life, Ed Warren was a much edgier person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw him on Sally Jesse.
Yeah, he's a much edgier person. So when Ed Warren met George Lutz, let me put it to you this way: Ed Warren did not have a lot of patience, or as they say, suffer fools gladly. Which is not to say that George Lutz was a fool. He was not a fool by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah.
But Ed Warren is like, okay, George, tell me what happened. And George wasn't telling him. And Ed was like, well, how can we help you? And, it went back and forth. And Ed was like, okay, come on, Lorraine, let's go. Ed had driven 3.5 hours on his own time, on his own gas. And it's like, how are we going to help you?
Yeah.
So Father Pecoraro was there at the time. Mm-hmm. Finally, the Lutzes did start to open up. And anyway, the next night, about 9 o'clock, I had been out Saturday night. I had been out walking my dog, and George Lutz had called, and my mother took the call. And she talked to George for about a half an hour. And then George said, oh, Laura, can you come out and talk to us? So I went out, drove out to the island to talk to he and Kathy. Again, the gist of all this is that Kathy and George were two very scared people.
Yeah.
And, Kathy's brother, Jimmy, and his wife, Carrie, were there. And they had their own experiences.
Yeah, they took his money, didn't they? He lost his money.
$1,800 was lost.
And she saw, when they came back from their honeymoon and they were sleeping in the house, she saw a ghost at the end of her bed.
Yes.
I read that.
And by the way, it was when I went out there that Saturday night, and this is like February 28th, leap year, I guess.
Yeah.
They played a tape recording for me that they had made with Weber and Burton. They explained to me at that time that they had cut off contact with Weber and Burton. And this is one of the questions that a lot of people have. Did the Lutzes make up this story about the haunting?
Yeah.
And certainly when they got together with Weber and Burton, there were discussions about putting the house establishing a trust, putting the house into a trust, and basically turning it almost into a haunted house attraction. Mm-hmm. And, exaggerating some of the events that happened around the house, around their experiences, etc. And they discussed that. And George said to me, look, we're not proud of this, but they played me the whole tape. So yes, there were discussions about that, about doing that, but the Lutzes opted out of that. So if anybody asks, were there aspects of the Amityville Horror that were exaggerated, falsified? Yes, you would have to say that. Yeah. Jay Anson, when he wrote his book, he actually said that he took literary license on certain aspects. The Lutzes appeared on, they gave several TV interviews, and they also said certain things that were alleged to have happened were exaggerations and never occurred. Mm-hmm. But Kathy, when they did the History's Mysteries 2-hour documentary back in 1999, 2000, I was on that as well. Mm-hmm. At that point, Kathy was ill. That was, I think, the last interview she gave. Mm-hmm. She was on oxygen at the time. She said, look, I know this happened, so I believe that something happened to them.
Yeah, me too.
That's my personal belief.
You don't just leave all your stuff behind.
No, you don't. We arranged to go in on March 6th, Saturday night, to film what I called, the seance, or what I called the psychic slumber party. Mm-hmm. Now, what happened, though, was in that ensuing week, it was myself. Steve Bauman suddenly went on vacation, and so it became Marvin Scott was the reporter while I was producing for him. We had a 3-man news crew. Our assignment editor and general manager, John Parsons Pedito, invited Mike Linder of WNEW, our affiliate radio station, Mike Linder, to come. Meanwhile, what happened was the Warrens invited several psychic friends that they knew to come along. And the Lutzes had also invited several psychic researchers to come along, which might sound like a good idea in theory, but in practice, it became sort of unwieldy.
Yeah.
When you think about it. So
too many cooks in the kitchen kind of thing.
Well, yeah, because it sort of degenerated, if you will. There was just too much going on.
Yeah.
So we did. There ended up being about 20 people there. But again, what happened was George Lutz that week, by that Thursday, March 4th, George Lutz was getting hinky, and he was threatening to withdraw permission to go in and film.
Why?
But the idea of this seance was to try and purge whatever was in the house. We had, but there were a whole bunch of people who were there. I didn't even know until I got to the house that night, the whole cast of characters who would be showing up. And I have to tell you, Alex Tanos and Carlos Osis, who were from the New York Psychical Research Society, they were there. I didn't know that they were going to be showing up. And Alex Tanos sort of looks like the actor Christopher Lee.
Okay.
When you go into the Amityville house in the side door, there are these windows of side lights. I was putting the key in the door, and his face appeared in the side window. I almost jumped off the doorstep. If you ever saw Christopher Lee when he played Dracula,
oh yeah,
in the 70s, he has that. He has that beak-like nose, and those scary dark eyes.
Yes.
That's what he looked like to me. Okay, now here I am going into a supposedly haunted house, in the dark, and I see this face looking at me.
Yeah, Nosferatu.
Well, exactly. I was like, well, he just appeared, and I was startled, but he's, that's who he looked like. And then I'm like, who are all these people who showed up? And then the Warrens had brought all these people with them. And then, then there were some people from this, the Duke University School. Well, it wasn't really the Duke University School of Parapsychology. It was Dream Lab. But there were all these people that I didn't even know were going to show up. The Warrens brought Alberta Riley, another psychic friend of theirs, Mary Pascarella. Then they had Paul Bart. Then there was this other guy, George Kokoris. You name it. I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
It was,
it was a full house.
So
it was a full house. So we did have the seance, and as I said, what was interesting about all of this, it was almost, when we got there, it was almost like most people started to arrive at about 6 o'clock. The house was lit up like an amusement park. Now, what strikes you when you go in the house, the Lutz's possessions were all still intact. The dining room, it looked like, they were still living there.
Yeah.
The dining room table, they still had the gingerbread cake house that Kathy had made for the kids for Christmas.
Yeah, wow.
And Marvin Scott, by the way, didn't get there until at least 11 o'clock because he had to do the 10 o'clock news. There was an almost like party-like atmosphere, and Ed Warren was quite frankly concerned that this might prevent anything productive from being accomplished, And, by the way, there was another fellow there from Paul Doherty from the National Star.
Oh, no.
Yes. Well, Mike Linder and Paul Doherty went out for coffee and cake. Then Ed Warren, myself, George Kokoris, and his friend, we sort of Ed turned off the lights and said, hey, let's just sit quietly here, and George Kokoris was there. He was a grad student and a researcher that was supposed to be. They were loosely affiliated with, this Dream Lab from Duke University, and they were sort of antagonistic. And George Kokoris' friend, I don't even remember the fellow's name, actually asked Ed with a straight face if he'd ever seen a ghost. So
was Ed just seething?
Yeah, well, sort of, Yeah. So actually, from about 8:30 to, from about 9 o'clock to 9:30, we were sitting in the dark for half an hour, and then the doorbell rang, and the lights went on, and what was really funny about this, and it was comical, there was a kid who was about 20 years old, and he was in a tuxedo, and he was obviously on his way to the prom or something, and he had just rang the wrong doorbell. So nobody could tell him how to get where he's going. It would have been the kid would have been very surprised if we told him, where he was, what doorbell he rang. So we closed the door, decided to keep the lights on, and, I asked Ed, do you really expect anything's going to happen tonight? Because there's an awful lot of people. Yeah. So then a few minutes later, the people who went out for food came back with milk, cookies, coffee cake. And Mike Linder was just happy. He had gone out when they went out to get food, Lorraine Warren and Alberta Riley had gone out with them. So Mike had gotten, he's the radio reporter. Mm-hmm. He had gotten some good sound bites. So about 10 o'clock, Marvin and the film crew arrived, and somebody else had subbed for Marvin so that he wouldn't miss anything. And Marvin says, you better brief me on this. Marvin wasn't very happy to be doing this story, by the way. Yeah. Because Steve had just taken off for the Bahamas, Steve Bauman, go on vacation, and Marvin was livid. He and his wife had tickets to a Broadway show, a sold-out Broadway show, and dinner with friends that they had these tickets for months. And his wife was going to kill him. So Marvin only found out at the 11th hour that he was going to be doing this story. And he was not happy. No. Then, and we've got a camera crew, by the way, who knew nothing about the story because these were not our regular camera crew. So they were all, adjusting, the camera crew is, adjusting, getting their gear ready, etc. So Marvin is, talking with Ed and Lorraine Warren, renewing acquaintances. And, everybody's really wandering around, chatting in small groups. Steve Petropoulos, who was our cameraman, we were chatting at the foot of the stairs, and I was introducing him. And then Steve, he's about 40 years old. He's very fit. And you have to understand, going back to the 70s, we had 3-man camera crews, and the equipment in those days, the camera equipment in particular, was a lot heavier than what it is today. So the cameramen had to be very fit, because often they were running down the street chasing people, the videography equipment. Right. So Steve said, hey, I'm going to take a look around. And so he started walking up the center stairs, and he had gone about 5 steps up, and he turned around, and he said to myself and Alberta Riley, he said, there's a room on the 2nd floor. It's the 2nd door on the right. And he says, that room is filled with mirrors. Now, that was the master bedroom. Mm-hmm. And the wall behind the bed, that had those 12 by 12 mirrored tiles that you usually see in Las Vegas. That had been the master bedroom that was Louise and Ronald Defeo Sr.'s bedroom.
Mm-hmm.
And that had mirrors on the one wall. He had never been in the house before, and there hadn't really been pictures of that. And Steve Petropoulos lived in New Jersey. So there would be no way that he would have known that.
Yeah. But he did.
Well, he turned around and he said to me, he said, I don't know how I know that. And Alberta said to me, I'm not surprised. And then Steve continued up the stairs, and just before he gets to the top landing, he doubles over in pain. I mean, and I saw his face was flushed, and then his face drained of color. And then he stumbles down the stairs, and a bunch of us rushed over to him, and he's gasping, and he says his heart had, he was managed to tell us that his heart had started to palpitate as though we were having a heart attack.
Oh, my goodness.
And he said he didn't have any history of heart trouble. So we get him some water. He sits there for a few minutes, and the pain subsides. And I'm like, now he was not faking this. And this, by the way, I do recall he used to run.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he was slim. He was about 40 years old. You know, he was very fit.
He was fit, so it's not like he's gonna have a heart attack from walking up some stairs.
Yeah.
No, and he had his light meter in his hand. He didn't have his camera in his hand.
Yeah.
And he was, he wasn't running up the stairs. He was just strolling. So then, no sooner does Steve feel better than Mary Pascarella, one of the psychics. She starts feeling nauseous and dizzy. So then somebody takes her upstairs so she can lie down and rest for a few minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So then about 15 minutes later, she comes down, and then we start the seance. And so what happens is Ed tells George Kokoris and his friend that he really doesn't want them present because the way they're walking around joking and, as Ed put it, challenging the house is not. But they insist on being present for the seance. So Ed says, okay, you're just asking for it.
Oh.
So Jerry Sullivan, he decided he wasn't going to join us for the seance. But all of the reporters, myself included, we were sitting with pens, notebooks, tape recorders at the ready. And one thing that's funny is, hey, wait, we can't start the seance until we get the lighting right and the camera angles all set up. And Ed basically said the candles and the crucifix should serve as irritants, which will antagonize any, demonic forces.
Yeah.
So I had Marvin Scott on my right and Mike Linder on my left. And then we had the three psychics there, Lorraine, Alberta Riley, and Mary Pascarella.
Mm-hmm.
And they all had their eyes closed and their hands cupped together in front of them. So Ed basically sat at the head of the table, and he began to guide Lorraine into a light trance-like state. So anybody listening here, Lorraine's light trance-like state differs from a full trance medium who would really go into an altered state where they would not know what's going on. Mm-hmm. Lorraine, in a light trance state, is still aware of her surroundings, even though she's channeling other messages.
Mm-hmm.
So at first, she didn't get anything except a solid, dark mass.
Oh.
So it's sort of like, and she speaks slowly, and it looks like she's got her eyes closed. It looks like she's straining to see a picture on a TV screen. And she basically says that she believes certain people give the force in the house energy.
Right.
And she mentioned George Lutz as being one of them.
Yeah.
Lorraine's words, not mine. And she also said that she saw an older bearded clergyman in a black garb that uses old rituals. And she thought that this person would be the one who would be able to rid the house of the force, but that it would take him several occasions to do so. And Lorraine also thought that George Lutz was spiritually warned to leave the Amityville house before personal tragedy struck he and his family. And she felt that it would be difficult for anyone to live in the house in peace until the force had been expelled. And while Lorraine was in the light trance state, Marvin tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, I just felt a chill and a sort of numbing sensation." And then 5 minutes later, Mike Linder leaned over and said, "Hey, I just felt a chill." And I'm sitting here and I'm like, okay, I don't feel anything. And then the next thing I see, Alberta Riley, she's at the other end of the table, and she yells out, "It's upstairs in the bedroom." And then she starts gasping for air and has heart palpitations. It seems like it was similar to Steve Petropoulos. And then Mary Pascarella talks about a subtle, pervasive element in the house which affected a tall, thin man who lived in the late 1800s. At that point, Ed Warren said that he thought that the psychics have extended themselves enough, and he halted the seance about, I don't know, I guess it was about 11:30. George Koukouris, the guy who was a skeptic, he got up out of his seat and ran out of the room, retching. And then he said, "Oh, it wasn't the seance that affected me at all." So around about midnight, after we all dispersed into groups, and people basically, sort of went off.
Regrouping.
Well, yeah, doing their own thing. And Ed Warren suggested that George Koukouris and his friend go downstairs and sit quietly in the basement and wait for something to happen. I think Ed just wanted them to get out of his way.
Yeah.
But psychics seem to get, different impressions and things. At that point, what happened was about 3 a.m., Marvin said, we haven't, we haven't gotten the bacon yet. We haven't really gotten it. He says, he asked Ed and Lorraine if we could conduct a mini seance in the sewing room, which Lorraine said she felt was the source of a lot of evil. And, we did that, but it looked more like a talk in a dimly lit room for effect. Okay. Mike Linder went up into the third floor bedroom, which had been George Defeo Jr.'s room, and he just sort of stayed there. He ended up sleeping there, and waking up the next morning, he was the only one in the house. And and nothing happened to him, which is funny. So he aired a story on the radio that said, "Coming to you from the not-so-haunted house in Amityville."
Yeah.
And everybody went nuts. Because, again, as I said, people had preordained notions. So Mike Linder was always a skeptic about it. And he said, look, the house wasn't haunted. Nothing happened to me.
Yeah.
But it didn't matter. Even though Mike Linder felt nothing happened to him. He slept in the house overnight. Nothing happened. He produced a story that said nothing happened. all the calls came in and people just went nuts, and Mike couldn't figure it out. And by the way, he's a very respected reporter.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what he wrote. That's what he felt.
That was his experience.
Yes, exactly.
You know, that was his, and that was his experience. There was
now the kicker to that. So finally, around 4:35 a.m., Ed Warren said, "Look, let's pack it up and go home. There's nothing more that's going to happen tonight. There's too much activity. The circumstances aren't right."
Yeah.
So as we all were departing, as luck would have it, packing up our gear, and there's a community driveway there between the 112 Ocean Avenue, or now 108 Ocean Avenue, and the house next door, which was owned by this family, the Irelands. And as we're packing up, the couple next door arrives home, and they're in a rather inebriated and hostile state. So they start angrily demanding that our crew, which might have been like 1 foot, our camera crew had a little bit of their gear, mm-hmm. maybe 1 foot over onto their property. And again, there's no fence there. Remove the electronics gear mm-hmm. from their portion of the driveway. So our camera guy immediately he doesn't say anything. He just picks up his gear and he moves it out of the way, etc. Next thing you know, the cop car shows up. They must have gone into the house and called the cops. Mm-hmm. And they want to know what's going on. And the cops say to us, "We haven't been informed by George Lutz that anybody's going to be in the house." Now, of all things, now this is funny, the cops say, "We want to see your press credentials." Now, here's Marvin Scott, won multiple Emmys. And you have to understand, Marvin Scott has been on every big story in New York that you can imagine. He was there when the Beatles arrived in 1964.
Oh, wow. Okay.
He was on the march with Martin Luther King from Selma. I mean, he's a very well-known face in New York.
Visible, yeah.
Marvin does not have his press credentials on him.
Oh,
no. Okay, so here's little old me. Okay, 19 and a half, 20 years old, lowly news assistant. I had to produce my press credentials, which is a real joke. Because I'm standing next to Marvin Scott, multiple Emmy winner, who's interviewed everybody. Right. So I have to show my press credentials and my driver's license. So this checked out. So the cops then relaxed and started to chat with us about basically what a pain in the arse that 112 Ocean Avenue has become. Yeah. And again, they started telling us what we've heard before. The cops are coming up the Amityville River by boat, landing at the Lutz's Pier, trying to break into the house. So just then, after everything that hasn't happened, if we were waiting to see Poltergeist and it didn't happen that night, it was too bad that our camera crew did not were not filming, because here comes Mrs. Ireland out of her house, and she's obviously in an altered state, and she's walking up and down the driveway, running, "Yoo-hoo, Ronnie, you want to come out and play guns?
Oh.
You want to come out and play ghosts?"
What?
Yeah.
What? What would possess her to do that?
Well, you used that word. Say it again. What would possess her to do that? I'm telling you, you can't make that stuff up. We're just looking at her. Exactly.
Wow.
Well, I mean, so sometimes truth is stranger than fiction.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's one of the behind the scenes stories.
Yeah.
That is downright creepy.
Well, yeah, because it's certainly in bad taste, and at that point, and so here's. I mean, I'm looking at Marvin. He's looking at me. Our camera crew. We're all looking at each other like, oh, please. At this point, her husband comes out and grabs her, and gets her, grabs her in the house. Now, the other thing was, as I said, so. It's not true to say that nothing happened in the house that night.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly from the point of view, if you're looking for something like poltergeist or, turning on a faucet and seeing, green slime come out, mirrors cracking, blood coming, tables levitating. No, it's not. It was not, The Conjuring or Poltergeist.
Right.
But it is true, and, Mike Linder, Marvin Scott, Marvin, to this day, Marvin is funny. He'll tell you, well, I felt a chill. I mean, today he'll say I felt a chill, but that night, sitting next to me, he says, hey, I just felt a chill.
Yeah.
Not, I just felt a chill. And Mike Linder says, hey, I just felt a chill.
Yeah. Yeah. It was exciting. It was their brush with the paranormal.
Well, yeah, I don't know if they'd call it the paranormal. I mean, both of them, are skeptical. And I have to say, look, I'm there, and as a reporter and as a producer there that night, I can tell you what happened and what didn't happen. Certainly, the most obvious thing that happened that night was Steve Petropoulos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Who had no history of anything, it wasn't just that he became visibly ill with the heart palpitations, but before, just like a minute before that happened to him, he walked up the stairs, 5 steps up, and he says, hey, there's a room on the second floor, the second door on the right, and it has one wall that's filled with mirrors.
Yeah.
And he said to me, and I don't know how I knew that.
Well, he's sensitive, and it's just not something he ever really looked at, Well,
but he was even puzzled by how he knew that because he had no way of knowing that. So those two things with Steve, and then several people became ill.
Yeah.
There, okay, Alberta, Mary Pascarella, George Kokoris. Marvin and Mike Linder both feeling a chill. Now, what was odd to me about that is I was sitting in between them, and I didn't feel a thing. Go figure. A week later, and I had the Lutz's house keys.
Yeah.
Decided I was going to go in myself. And I did take my dog, Fritz, who was a German Shepherd Labrador mix. And, these days we're finding out more and more about our animal friends and how they can be empaths.
Yeah.
Oh, there are certainly animals, that can sense when a person is going to have a heart attack, an epileptic, or a diabetic seizure.
Yeah.
Now, I can tell you, Fritz was about 4 or 5 years old. He never sensed any of those things, but if he were trained for, because he was never around anybody in our family who had anything like that. But I have no proof of this, but I just feel like he is one of those animals who could have done that. When I went in on the middle of a Saturday afternoon, I just wanted to look around for myself and see. And again, there wasn't, really much to see. I mean, the house, it's a beautiful house. By today's standards, it actually looks, kind of, the furnishings are kind of kitschy, 70s type thing. Think, Brady Bunch type stuff.
Yeah.
And again, it looked like the family had just left for the day. Okay. And I was walking around, and the dog was in the foyer, and all of a sudden I heard him growling. So I walked back out, And there he is standing at the foot of the stairs to a point, and it was that point where everybody seemed to become ill. Like Lorraine, when she went in at one point, didn't feel well at one point in the stairs and, on the stairs, and said she had a headache afterwards for a couple of days. And the dog is just staring at some fixed point, and his ears were back, and the hackles were up from his neck all the way down to his back.
Oh, my.
And I had never seen him act that way before. This was a friendly dog, and again, he was, dog was, from, Queens, New York, so he was used to a lot of different things.
Yeah.
If it had just been a squirrel in the attic, he wouldn't have reacted that way.
Right.
And he was not moving. He was growling. And he was, he was like he was just in a fixed stare, like he could see something and I couldn't. Started up the stairs, and I thought, the dog knows something I don't. This is probably not a good idea.
Yeah.
And I went down the stairs and said, call me chicken, but I'm out of here. Well, it's one of those things, whenever you see one of those horror movies.
Yep. Why is she going up the stairs?
Well, no, or why is she running through the woods in high heels? Or why is she going into the house to hunt the vampire when the sun is just about to set? Really stupid stuff. But animals have an instinct.
Yeah, they do.
Okay, I've been in my own house here. And my dogs, I'll have all the windows closed, and my dogs will be in the house, and they will catch a scent, and they'll start barking and running around, and I'll look out the window, and I will see there's a fox outside. Or one day there was a coyote walking up my front lawn. I live in central Massachusetts, and I'm, surrounded by woods. There's a lot of wildlife out here. Another time, I went outside and I couldn't see a damn thing. And turns out my dog knew that there was like a woodchuck up in the tree. I didn't know it.
No, they know. I mean, I live in bear country, and we'll be sitting there in the living room just minding our own business, and all of a sudden Finnegan will get up and he'll jump on the bed in the bedroom and start barking out the bedroom door. My bedroom faces the back lot, which is 9 acres. And we'll be like, what is it? There's nothing. Like, there's nothing wrong. Sure enough, maybe 2 minutes later, there's a bear on the road. So they're highly sensitive.
Well, and I would have felt better if I thought it was wildlife. But this, again, was Suffolk County. No wildlife around.
Yeah.
So 9 months later, in January 1977, I went back into the house with Hans Holzer and Ethel Myers Johnson.
Right.
Who is a deep trance medium. At this point, the house had been cleaned out because the Lutzes let the bank foreclose on it.
Oh, yeah.
And they were moving, they moved at this point that's the summer of 76, moved to California. Okay, and they struck a book deal with Prentice Hall. Jay Anson wrote the book, The Amityville Horror, and I went into the house with Hans Holzer, and again, the house was completely clean. It was stripped bare of all furniture. And it was interesting because what happened was, when I went in with Hans, he had a video camera, and the video camera froze up.
Huh.
And it wasn't, it was about 30, 32 degrees, so that shouldn't have happened when you think about it.
A reel-to-reel camera?
No, it was just a...
Not a digital camera.
Yes.
Wow.
No, it wasn't a digital. It was just a regular video camera.
Just like video camera. But it froze up.
Yeah, at the time. It kept freezing up on him. He did get some interesting tape, but Ethel Johnson Myers, she went into a full trance at the time. And what came through was the spirit of an Indian boy who had lived there, a couple of 100 years before.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, he was upset because some modern-day boys had found his skull and were kicking it around, like playing football with it.
Oh my goodness gracious.
So, and of course, that brought up all the research that I had done on it being an Indian burial ground.
Yeah.
But when you talk about Indian burial ground, it's not like something out of Jeremiah Johnston, the movie.
With Robert Redford.
An Indian burial ground. In fact, where I grew up in a town in Queens, New York, College Point, which is also on the water.
Yeah.
Native Americans, the Shinnecock Indians, the Matinecock tribe, occupied all of Long Island. You go back, before the white settlers came.
Yeah.
They often, even in my hometown in the 1930s, when they were doing excavations, they found evidence of the Indian settlements and Indian burial grounds. So, yes, the Indians, occupied land by the water, and they often, buried their dead by the water.
Mm.
Okay, but it was not like we think of as in Last of the Mohegans or Jeremiah Johnston.
Right, okay.
Okay, so it's perfectly normal that you would find that type of evidence there. And if you look at the Histories, Mysteries documentary that was made on Amityville, Horror or Hoax, there was an elder of the tribe that was interviewed there who said, this is perfectly, logical that this might have happened.
Right.
It's in those days, why wouldn't you? I mean, you're going to stay by the water.
Yeah.
Certainly, and the original house was moved from a block away to where it is now.
Oh.
But yeah, I'm sure it's been added to, and of course the house has been renovated over the years, etc.
Yeah. And there hasn't been any further claims of it being haunted since then.
Well, officially, no. But that's not to say nobody has experienced anything. You just haven't really heard of it. I mean, certainly, yes, people have unofficially said that they've had experiences in the house. For instance, when there have been several realtors who've gone in to show the house.
Mm-hmm.
And even in the last 10 to 15 years, like there was a realtor in May 2010 named James Smith. He gave an interview to a Channel 4 news reporter, and he said when he went in, he had an eerie feeling. He said he felt like, something was there.
Oh.
Okay. And he said he took off and he got out of there. It was just a brief. It was just a brief statement.
Yeah.
But he kept quiet about it, and he was after he gave that little small interview to Channel 4. You can imagine a lot of people reached out to him and said, "Hey, tell us more," but he didn't want the publicity. But he did finally talk to a couple more people he's from Manhattan originally, and he moved to Amityville in '78, and so clearly he heard about the murders.
Yeah, yeah.
He became a real estate agent in 2003, and he did a lot of work in the Amityville area. So he heard about the listings. So they had an open broker open house in May 2010, and he went in with another woman, a woman named Laura Zambrato of Daniel Gale Sotheby's International.
Mm-hmm.
And this fellow, James Smith, he went in with another female coworker who wanted to remain anonymous. And so as this guy, James Smith, went in with, say, a Jane Doe, they went in and went to the second floor, and apparently the woman he was with said, "Hey, something feels weird here, doesn't it?" And James said, "Yeah, it does." But he said at the time he didn't really feel anything, and, they figured they were just spooking themselves because they were in the Amityville Horror House.
Because they knew, yeah.
Yeah. Then, look, it's very possible to spook yourself.
Totally. I do it all the time.
Yeah, I mean, so then they went into the basement area, and they were down by where the oil burner is, and then they said, "Oh, did you feel that?" And they felt the temperature in the room drop.
Ooh.
And then they said they looked up and saw a hole in the wall, and they felt that there was freezing cold air coming from this hole in the wall. And they said it was very, very cold, and it was the middle of summer, and it was like 90 degrees outside. So he said that there was a concrete wall with a square hole, and then he said it was like somebody had just opened up a freezer door, and he got goosebumps, and he said, the entire group just decided to leave the house in a big hurry. And then apparently a reporter from Channel 4 scurried over to them because I guess they could see by the way everybody was leaving that maybe something had happened.
Yeah.
Oh,
scurried over.
Then I guess some of the other agents were saying that they had never met. One said, "I'm not going back into that house," and so they got into the cars and just took off. And that's when this fellow James gave the reporter an interview, and this James Smith said, "I'm the biggest skeptic that there is, and if I was by myself, I would have thought that maybe I've just, have too many of the Amityville Horror movies in my head. But because I was with other people, we were all having the same feelings. It legitimized the experience." Now, by the way, there is such a thing as
mass.
I think group fear or group hypnosis.
Yeah.
You could say that too. I'm playing devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
You can all spook yourself.
Yeah.
So he said he didn't get shortness of breath, but he said he did feel like he was up on a high altitude on a mountain, like his ears were going to pop. He said that it wasn't until they were down there for a few minutes that they all noticed a drastic temperature change. But the other woman from Sotheby's, when she spoke to Channel 4, she said, "Oh, no, the house is spectacular. It's beautifully done. It's the most charming house. There isn't anything in it that made me feel uncomfortable. I don't see any haunting. I didn't feel any haunting."
Mm-hmm.
Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, maybe she, like I said, I think some people are more sensitive than others, like your mom. Look at the difference between you and your mom, right?
Well, I'll tell you something funny. I have to, if you hang around with psychics and you go on these investigations, as I've gone on, some of it will start to rub off on you. I think we all have psychic abilities.
A little bit,
they don't,
yeah.
Sixth sense or nothing. Like, just as all of us have eyesight and hearing, we all have it to different degrees.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Anybody can be taught to learn to play the piano, but that doesn't mean we're going to be Mozart or Van Cliburn. There are very few people. So, May 6th, 2006, I'm sitting here in my office, and the thought pops into my head, I have to call Lorraine Warren. Now, I hadn't talked to Lorraine in about a year, and I'm like, It's sometimes you'll say, oh, gee, I should call so-and-so. I haven't talked to them in a while.
Yeah.
It wasn't like that. It was, I need to call Lorraine Warren. I need to call her now. So I pick up the phone and I call Lorraine. And she answered. Lorraine, hi, how are you? And we were on the phone for about 2.5 hours, catching up, having a normal conversation. Of course, we talked about Amityville and various things about the case. And, I talked about, you remember the phone booth incident, and, and she talked about, we were laughing about that, diabolical confusion and all this. And I said, how's Ed doing? Because at that point, Ed had he had a stroke several years before, and he had, lost, he was incapacitated and couldn't speak.
Yeah.
Anyway, later that night, I hear, it comes over the news that while I was at the very moment I was talking to Lorraine, George Lutz had a heart attack out in Las Vegas and had died.
What?
Yep. So the next day, I call Lorraine back. I said, Lorraine, and obviously Lorraine had heard.
Mm-hmm.
I said, do you believe this? I said, and I had told her when I called her that she had popped into my head, and I, had the urge to call her. I said, do you believe that? I said, I had the urge, a really strong urge, sudden urge. You popped into my head like I had to call you at that moment. And Lorraine wasn't surprised. She said, uh-huh.
Yeah.
Now, that's not I'm sorry, there are many coincidences.
I was just going to say that,
That wasn't a coincidence.
It was not a coincidence. And I think we talked about this with Andrea last week as well. When it comes to these things, I don't want to say paranormal, supernatural, whatever you want to call it, that there seem to be a lot of, and I say with air quotes, coincidences. So, yeah. Not coincidence.
I did have another. I did have something that happened to be that I believe is a coincidence. Now, Ed and Lorraine had a person that worked with them, Brian McIntyre, who worked with them on many cases over many years. And I was coming out of my local supermarket here a few years ago, and the fellow comes up to me and says, "Aren't you Laura DiDio?" And I said, "Yes." And he says, "I'm Brian McIntyre," and he's now an Eastern Orthodox priest, Father Maximos McIntyre. But he says, "This is the Brian McIntyre that worked for many years with Ed and Lorraine Warren. He lives right nearby me." So that's a coincidence.
Yeah, he's close to you.
Yeah, but
funny.
But the other thing, so the Amityville, and of course Lorraine passed away just less than a month ago.
Yeah.
The age of 92, and I think it's interesting. She passed away on Good Friday, and she was a very big devotee of Saint Padre Pio.
That's right, she was, yeah.
And Lorraine always carried a relic of what she felt was the true crucifix of Christ.
That's right.
Saint Padre Pio had the stigmata.
Mm-hmm.
So I think she would have been happy to have passed away on Good Friday.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet she was. Yeah.
Yeah, but she always, I think the real legacy, to me, of Ed and Lorraine Warren, for all that they are identified with the paranormal, and as, a psychic and a demonologist, is how much they did to try and help.
Yeah.
Really. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
And they were extremely humble people. They really were. And they were not, even when, for all the celebrated circumstances in their life about The Conjuring.
Yeah.
And the Amityville.
High-profile cases.
Yeah, they were, you could call them up. They remained very accessible.
Yeah.
I do remember going up to their house one time, and before Annabelle was in the basement, we went out to lunch, and she had been in the one of the back rooms on the porch, and she was in one place, and we came back from lunch, and she was on the opposite side of the room.
Oh, the doll?
Yeah, the doll.
Oh.
She doesn't look the doll, I mean, she doesn't look creepy. The way the way they made her look in the movies.
She's just a Raggedy Ann doll, isn't she?
Yeah, it looks like a very innocuous doll.
Yeah.
Swear to God, that doll had moved from one place to the other. In the
So, Laura, I'm afraid we're running out of time, and I wanted to give you a few minutes to plug the book that you are coming out with here soon.
Well, the book is it's basically called My Amityville Horror: A Reporter's Notebook, and it talks about everything we've been talking about. What has happened? You know, it's my recounting. First-person account of all of the events surrounding Channel 5's investigation into the Amityville Horror, talking about my experiences with Ed and Lorraine Warren and also with Hans Holzer, and what's happened in, what I've done in working with the documentaries and all the interviews I've done, since then, and experiences and some of these things that we've talked about today, the coincidences and the things that I don't think are coincidences. So the inside first-person accounts.
That delves that's fun. That delves deeper into the story from your point of view.
Yes, and it gives you the background into the personalities. We also dig deeper into the things like the documentary that we did a few years ago in 2013 that I did with that was spearheaded by Eric Walter, who's a wonderful director, producer, and filmmaker. The My Amityville horror documentary that we did with Danny Lutz.
Yeah, which I saw, which was fantastic. It's funny. In order to prep for this interview, I watched it again, and I was thinking, why haven't we heard more from Eric Walters? Because the way just his filmmaking in general is amazing.
I think ultimately, when you look at Amityville, it's really more of a story about the living and how so many lives were destroyed. When you think of families were destroyed.
Yeah.
The entire Defeo family was destroyed by this.
Yeah.
The Lutz family was inexorably changed by the 28 days that they spent in that house.
And the lifetime of living with that legacy, because when I watched the Amityville Horror, you can see how it's really affected Daniel Lutz's entire life.
Yeah, and Christopher has also been, Christopher and Danny have been very affected by it. Yeah. Melissa Missy was only 5. She's never really talked to the press, and I certainly can't blame her. When Danny, that was the first time he talked to the press about it, and that where you would hope it was cathartic for him.
Yeah.
Danny and Christopher just want people to believe them.
Yeah.
But they were kids when that happened. I mean, and could you imagine if that happened to them today? But they were actually ridiculed quite a bit.
Yeah.
When they were in school. It would be much worse today.
Yeah.
But
that's
a tough thing. They were certainly aware, even though Kathy and George tried to keep them out of the spotlight. There's no way to totally shield kids from that.
No.
Is there a release date for your book?
Yeah, when's your book come?
It should be out before the end of this year. I'm finishing. I'm getting the manuscript to my publisher by the end of July, so it should be out. I'm guessing late fall. Probably late October. Just in time for Halloween.
Perfect. We'll keep an eye out for it. You'll share it, right? You'll make it accessible for us to see?
Absolutely.
So, we want to thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show tonight. It's been a fascinating conversation to get, very few people actually had access to the Amityville house, and very few remain and are willing to talk about it. And I can't express my gratitude enough. We do end our show with a prayer of protection. I'm going to do that really quick. The light of God surrounds us. The love of God enfolds us. The power of God protects us. The presence of God watches over us. Wherever we are, God is. Laura, thank you so much for being on ParaDivas. And until the next episode, stay scared.